Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our next session is titled, My Nationalism is Humanity. We Are One is Better Than We're Number One. We invite the moderator to the screen, independent journalist Amy Chu. You may have the floor.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me? Okay, we have 8 very distinguished speakers here, so I'm not going to speak a lot so that all of them can have their time to speak. And okay, welcome everyone, and thank you all who have agreed to participate in tonight's session. Before I begin, I would also like to thank all the people who signed up to join this session, all the young people. I want to thank you for taking an interest in this event, and hopefully we leave some food for thought that perhaps could guide and shape some of the values. And we hope we, the grown-ups, can contribute something to help you make the world a better place. So without much ado, the first speaker I'm going to invite is from Singapore, Dr. Leong Chan Hong, and he is with the RSIS based in Singapore. And my question to him is, with the intense US-China rivalry, where China is deemed as a huge competitor and sometimes also as a threat, does this have an effect of dehumanizing ordinary Chinese citizens in China who lead ordinary, hardworking lives just like anyone else? Does this create less sympathy for mainland Chinese in times of crisis and disasters? We have seen how Chinese immigrants and Asians were attacked in America during COVID-19 as they were blamed for spreading the virus. Dr. Leong, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you for inviting me to this platform. Now, if you look at the history of human civilizations, you realize that whenever there's a rise of a new great power that potentially threatens the existing dominance, economic and cultural dominance of an existing superpower, that tend to invite a pushback, and that tend to make people in that current superpower to view the other community as being a very homogeneous one. And this is something that is not new. I think we've seen that in, say, during the Second World War, and how Americans treated Japanese Americans. And this is essentially a function of stereotyping and scapegoating. And the idea of that is really to help Americans make sense of what are some of the challenges they have going through, what are some of the transitions and transformations that threaten, that undermine US dominance. Now, the Chinese cannot change how the Americans view them, but certainly they can change how they react to these stereotypings. Because at the end of the day, I think one thing's for sure, and that is, the world is becoming more and more multicultural. It's becoming more and more diverse. You have Americans and Chinese and people of all nationalities living in different parts of the world, working together. And I think the important thing is, how can you uphold that for the Chinese, for example, right? How can they uphold the norms of inclusion to show them that they are better, they're bigger than the Americans, bigger in the sense that they have a bigger heart. They are not looking at a very myopic, representation of who you are based on your nationality alone, but based on what you do. And I think this is important because, it's not easy to change opinion of another community, of another tribe. But certainly, over time, if you demonstrate that sincerity, if you demonstrate that you are there to uphold certain universal values of inclusion, that will gradually change that view to one that is more positive. And you have seen that opinion being having changed to the positive, in the last few years. And what you see here, a lot of that has to do with the whole, in terms of the stereotyping, in terms of typecasting Chinese Americans or Chinese, in different parts of the world. It's really the politics of who belongs, the politics of membership, tribal membership, and that really should not be how that global relationship be defined, and certainly not it's not a very effective and meaningful way, right, to foster greater cohesion and inclusion.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's really illuminating. And the follow-up question is this: with the rise of China, what is the impact on the Chinese diaspora? They are spread across Southeast Asia and across the world, numbering around 50 million. Does it trigger economic resentment despite the diaspora not having any attachment to China? What could be done by the diaspora to mitigate any potential resentment?
This is actually an excellent question, Amy. We experience that here in Singapore, right? Being majority Chinese, but we practice very different culture. The Chinese in Southeast Asia, for example, we have a distinct heritage. We may be ethnically the same. We celebrate the same festivals, but I think if you speak to anyone in this part of the world, you know that we have very different values. It's a very multicultural Chinese values compared to a relatively more homogeneous kind of Chinese practices and norms in the mainland. And that sometimes can lead to a lot of misunderstanding because people tend to think that because you're of the same race and therefore you tend to show the same affinity and affiliation to mainland China, which is not the case. And I wouldn't say that this leads to resentment, but certainly there's a quite a fair bit of misunderstanding from time to time because people think that you are naturally pivoting to support Chinese and mainland China. So I think how do you mitigate it? I think, to be honest, I think the onus is not on the Chinese from mainland, but rather from the diaspora, right? To show that we practice and embrace a different set of norms. And in the case of Singapore, for instance, we have the Singapore Chinese Culture Center, one of the institutions that was established about 10 years ago. And the goal is really to demonstrate to Singaporeans and as well as visitors to Singapore that we practice a very different set of norms and values, and how to continue to share the very distinct characteristics, even if we share of the ethnic same heritage, but we have very different cultural norms and practices. So that I think those are some of the I suppose takeaways, right, for Chinese diaspora, not just in Singapore or Southeast Asia, but pretty much in other parts of the world. The same approach, to show that we are different in other ways.
Just very quickly, has the message by the Chinese diaspora, have they been able to get the message across that they are actually rather distinct and different from the mainland Chinese, apart from the festivals and some of the family values that they share?
Probably not, if I have to summarize in a nutshell. And the reason is being, these are cultural values, practices, and norms. What do you prioritize? I think those are things that you don't carry around, in your head wherever you go. These are things that are amorphous, but it shapes the way you think and you behave. Festival celebrations, those are things that you can see, you can visually identify, and people tend to assume, that because these are Chinese and therefore you practice the same norms and values like the one in mainland. And I think those are probably areas where the Chinese diaspora can do more in other parts of the world to demonstrate that even though we share the same heritage as ethnic Chinese, but the deep down, the values and the norms that we embrace may be different. And those are the areas that I think the Chinese diaspora, probably outside beyond Southeast Asia, probably can do more, right, to highlight that they are different.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leong. That was really insightful. Next, we have Nurul Izzah, Executive Chairman of Polity, a think tank based in Kuala Lumpur. She is a former MP who has served 3 terms. Unfortunately, Nurul can't be with us, but she has sent us a video in response to my question. So on Sunday, there was a boat carrying some 70 people, mostly Rohingyas, and the boat sank. I think there were only 30 to 31 bodies that was recovered. There was another boat carrying even more passengers, 230, but the fate of the passengers are unknown. The UN has called the Rohingyas the most persecuted people in the world. And Malaysia houses some 670 of them, according to the UN. Their plight has never been resolved and is worsening amid the current civil war in Myanmar, which was triggered following the 2021 military coup. So my question to Nurul is, what can Malaysia and the rest of ASEAN countries do to prevent refugee fatigue from setting in and to continue providing humanitarian assistance to them to keep the collective ASEAN humanity alive? And this is a response on video.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam hormat, selamat malam Pak Dino and the FPCI as well as global citizen community. Thank you for organizing this conference. Thank you for the question and thank you for having me. I'm sorry I can't join live with all of you, and I hope that we can consider clear, concrete follow-ups to ensure that at this juncture where all of us have been witnesses to a live stream genocide in Gaza, we are able to articulate a comprehensive, not just a national but regional response, especially when it comes nearer our shores. And you are talking about 70 people, 70 deaths, tragically, and another 230 souls, their fates yet unknown. And this tragedy, I think, really is something that we should be speaking about as a mainstream issue to handle collectively in ASEAN. The plight of the Rohingyas, people bearing the brutal title of the world's most persecuted. And of course, when you talk about Malaysia's response, I think first and foremost, we talk about how do you secure an official government statistic on the numbers of how many Rohingya refugees that Malaysia is hosting. The ones I'm quoting estimated ranging from about 100,000 by the UN to as high as 200,000 by groups like Doctors Without Borders as of March 2025. And to put this in perspective, it's more than how many Indonesia and Thailand combined are hosting. And it is a massive unspoken reality. And this leads to the core of the approach taken, which is informality. Malaysia, like all the neighbors in ASEAN, were not signatories to the UN Refugee Convention. So there's no law that recognizes what a refugee is. Instead, we've, I think, seen to outsource the problem, where UNHCR is, of course, seen to and have been doing the work of determining the status of refugee, providing documentation, and it's really very contradictory. In Malaysia's law, they are not able or not allowed to work, but this is, of course, since they do continue, they have to survive, it falls under informality. And I think what's important is when the defunding of the UN took place, and this perhaps began in the first Trump presidency, so the stateless in Malaysia, Rohingyas, have been working informally without rights, without protection, in such precarious situation, and this is replicated across the region. And of course, without being recognized, you have essentially created a permanent underclass. And it has become a policy which is largely built on ambiguity. When developed nations also have started defunding many UN bodies, UNHCR not exempted, the worst that bore the brunt was, of course, UNRWA. This began from the first presidency and has extended forward, worsening. So the issue of shifting financial burdens, the fact that who's going to have to carry this moving forward when you have such a huge number of refugees or stateless, becomes the primary concern of nations. So I think when we ask how to prevent refugee fatigue, we must admit first and foremost the realities of the system. And of course, it's created in ambiguities, and it will cause a lot of fatigue. And the issue of financial burden will be cited time and again by governments. And for me, one of the ways to look forward to consider very seriously, we had this discussion in Malaysia, in fact, in the first Harapan government in 2018, where the current Home Minister invited Mehmet Şimşek, who is now Finance Minister Turkey, or formerly Minister of Finance in Turkey, and they shared a different model. This was perhaps the first kind of bilateral, informal approach representing leaders in government to look at a different model where a city like Gaziantep in Turkey had addressed the massive influx of Syrian refugees but did not opt for informality. It was a chosen deliberate local strategy where they worked directly with international agencies to get resources into city level services, schools, clinics, housing, because they knew they were prepared for the sheer financial increase in managing an influx of people. Now, this, of course, requires political will, and it's not going to be easy for governments who are perhaps facing financial stress. But this humanitarian concern, they made a conscious choice to include refugees even in their official city development plan, and also had a clear-cut taxation mechanism for Syrian shops governing the rules and regulations governing when they open up their businesses. So they are seen and they are not hidden as potential participants because they are then recognized as taxpayers. So I feel that this is important because that opened up opportunities in job creation for both Syrians and Turks. And you see that a crisis then turns for an opportunity for resilience. Now, it's not easy. There were challenges, but Malaysia began with a few pilots, which also involved Rohingyas. But I think, of course, we have to escalate further, and we have to share these stories so that all countries in ASEAN, every country that clearly shares, this intention and the concern for humanitarian values, have this opportunity or take this opportunity to enact it into action. So formalizing the informal is important, but of course regulating it to have work permit programs in sectors that are required, but also understanding that this requires a more inclusive approach, upskilling approach. You certainly have to engage them, and it will involve a lot of assimilation processes which take into account differences in culture, in language, and so on and so forth.
Okay, that was Nurul Izzah. Thank you, Nurul. Our next speaker is Rabbi Elliot J. Baskin from the United States. He's the spiritual leader and interfaith peace globetrotter at Shalom Park in Aurora, Colorado. Good evening and welcome. My first question is, how do you view the war in Gaza? Has this war made interfaith dialogue between Muslim and Jewish people extremely difficult?
Well, shalom, salam, salamat pagi, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the Global Town Hall and especially the foreign policy community of Indonesia under the brilliant leadership of Pak Dino and Global Citizen for convening us all as one community of the world. The war, and I want to say thank you, Amy, for facilitating this session. The war in Gaza has been very painful for me personally, the entire Jewish community, and I know people throughout the world. We lament the loss of life on both sides and applaud the efforts for peace and reconciliation that are happening now. Our tradition teaches that whoever destroys a single life is considered to have destroyed an entire world. And thus we lament that so many people have lost their lives in this very painful war. So we look forward to the peace efforts which are coming now and the rebuilding, not just the physical rebuilding of the rubble, but rebuilding of relationships between Jews and Muslims and Christians and people throughout the region. Our tradition teaches to seek peace and pursue it, and there's nothing more important than doing that. As for the relations between Jews and Muslims today, not only are the relationships important, but they are imperative. And that's something that I've learned through 1,000 Abrahamic circles, which is something where we had, I had an imam and a reverend, one from Indonesia, one from New Zealand, was in my home and in my synagogue. We were able to learn from one another, to worship in each other's homes, to be able to dialogue, and to be able to see that we are truly all brothers and sisters of faith. And this Abrahamic tradition of hospitality, of peace seeking, and of sharing is crucial now.
Rabbi, does this make it difficult for your community to reach out and to have ties for interfaith dialogue and ties with the Muslim community, seeing that what's happening in Gaza is probably one of the most devastating in recent times? It has been devastating for both communities.
Absolutely. So for me, this has been, we move beyond the difficulty to the challenge. And it's not only a challenge, but it's imperative that we come together person to reestablish relationships. For we truly want to see the divine in everyone. According to our tradition, we are created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God. And it's so important for us to see the divine in one another and to foster those personal relationships one to one. And so just yesterday, I was at our multi-faith leadership dialogue in Denver, Colorado, and we were sharing what was happening in our lives and our hopes and prayers for peace in Gaza and Israel. So this has really told us that we have to ramp up our efforts to be Rodefei Shalom, pursuers of peace.
And my question has to do with New York. New York just elected its first Muslim and South Asian mayor, Zoran Mamdani. He was elected in a city with a large Jewish community and also the site of the largest terror attack on American soil, namely 9/11. His election, can you tell us, what does it say of the voters? Are we seeing openness and diversity at work here, where voters look beyond race and religion to entrust their future in a charismatic Muslim and South Asian?
Great question, Amy. I'm not a voter in New York, but I can say I think this reflects a hope for change, a change from the me generation to the we generation, as we come together for transformational change for the benefit of everyone in the city. And this is people looking beyond the color of a person's skin. And we hope that this new mayor will combat rising anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and prejudice of any type in New York, and be together for everyone. For as Martin Luther King once said, we may have come on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And this is a time that we hope for change, for tolerance, and for progress in the Big Apple.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah. Our next speaker is from Italy, Natalie Tocci. She's a director of Istituto Affari Internazionali. She's also a part-time professor at the European University Institute. Her research focuses on European foreign policy, and I have also had the pleasure of reading Natalie's excellent and insightful op-eds in The Guardian. So my question to you, the attacks in Ukraine have become far more massive and dangerous this year. On September 7th, for example, Russia launched 800 drones and missiles on Ukraine in a single day. The pounding that Ukrainians have endured is unimaginable. Yesterday, Russia launched a heavy drone and missile attack, killing 6 people in Kyiv and 2 more in the south, in strikes on energy facilities, apartment buildings, and infrastructure. As the war drags on, has fatigue set in and Ukraine is slowly being forgotten? In your view, should the world care about Ukraine, even in regions far away from Europe like Asia and Latin America, and why?
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for that question. And thank you for your kind words. It's an absolute pleasure to be back at the Global Town Hall. This is really one of my favorite events, and kudos for Dino and all the team for putting this together once again. So why is it that the world, and particularly as you were saying, Amy, regions further afield, why should they care about Ukraine? Now, what I could tell you is, and I will, but very briefly, is a list of kind of, both interest related and norm related reasons why this should be the case. It is clear that this is a war that has profoundly affected all sorts of domains, from energy to food security to, of course, nuclear proliferation. The sort of, threatening nuclear fast and loose has really generated, I think, a dreadful spiral of proliferation, not just in Europe or in the Middle East, but indeed further beyond as well. So there are clearly, as I said, energy, food, nuclear-related reasons why this should be the case. On top of this, there are very clearly normative reasons why we should care. This is very clearly a war in which the core principles of international law have been violated: territorial integrity, sovereignty. This is a war that has seen war crimes and crimes against humanity being perpetrated by Russia. So there are, again, also principled reasons why we should care. Now, I think, in a sense, the more interesting question is, given that this is the case, why is it that we don't care enough? And why is it that particularly countries further afield, countries in the global south, don't actually feel the war in Ukraine, for example, in the way in which they feel the war in Gaza? And I think this has probably 2 sets of reasons that are worth focusing on. On the one hand, we could say that the war in Ukraine can, at the global level, really be understood as a war between the global East and the global West. And this is basically a war where the global South kind of feels it doesn't really have skin in the game, right? So I think there's a question of responsibility, or rather lack of a feeling of responsibility, which really has a lot to do with the explanation. On top of this, I think there's another malady. And by the way, this is a malady which is not just in the global South, but as much in the global North. And that is, I think, the terrible difficulty that we have in actually having a coherent and consistent foreign policy. It is very easy to criticize our adversaries. It is much harder to criticize our friends. And so much like, and I'm the first one that says that indeed, for example, Europeans and Americans should be criticized for their double standards when it comes, for example, to Gaza, in the same way, I think that the same argument applies to countries in the global South and their reluctance to criticize particularly those countries that have very close relations with Russia, their reluctance to criticize Russia. If we actually want to pursue a principled foreign policy, what we should be doing is being not just strict with our adversaries, but in fact, even stricter in many respects towards our friends. And so this kind of brings me to, in a sense, my conclusion. What is it that we should do to about all of this? I think firstly, there's a question of acquiring or reacquiring a sense of responsibility vis-a-vis norms that in principle are shared. If we actually do believe in these norms, if we talk about these norms, then we all should actually feel not only responsible, but actually willing at times to even endure costs in order to ensure that those norms are being respected. And I think then finally, coming to the title, in fact, of this panel and the idea, indeed, of a shared humanity, is this idea that principles apply to adversaries in the same way as they apply to friends. And there should be, perhaps, in all of our foreign policy, far greater coherence in the way in which we talk and certainly act in the name of such principles. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up. In recent months, Russia is suspected of sending drones and violating airspace in Poland, Belgium, Denmark, and other countries in what some observers view as an attempt by Moscow to test European air defense. Seeing what's happening in Ukraine and airspace incursion over EU skies, what is the likelihood of a third world war breaking out in Europe?
So I actually don't think that a third world war is very likely at all. But I think that it is fairly clear. And to be honest, the recent drone attacks have simply made this far more explicit. But I think it's been very obvious that the war in Europe is a war that starts but does not end in Ukraine. To the extent that this is a war in which, and that can be explained by Russia's attempt at recreating a sphere of influence, at recreating empire, it is very clear that you don't go to war for 4 years and sacrifice over 1.5 million of your soldiers if all you want to do, quote unquote, is occupy 20% of Ukraine. It is clear that Russia's ambitions are much greater, and those ambitions indeed, and the drone attacks have really been exemplifying the way in which those ambitions are much greater. This is really a strategy that Russia is pursuing that has at least three components. There's a military component, which begins, but as we were saying, does not quite end with Ukraine, but certainly is concentrated in Ukraine. There is a hybrid component from cyber attacks to sabotage that has to do indeed with a much wider geographical space. And then there's a political component in which Russia is very actively seeking to support nationalist far-right parties and movements across Europe as really, I think, an integral element in the pursuit of recreating empire. Now, does all this amount to a third world war? No, it does not. I don't think that there should be excessive alarmism about all of this. But is this a war that has already spread beyond Ukraine? Absolutely so, given that the intention always began with but never ended with Ukraine.
Thank you, Natalie. That was most insightful. We move on to Richard Weig. He's the Director of Global Attitudes Research at Pew Research Center. I know I sent you 2 questions, but I was wondering whether, following on what Natalie just said about Ukraine, whether I can squeeze in an extra question, because I know you conducted a survey was it in 2022, about people's attitude towards Russia, and Malaysia in 2022 and also in 2024 emerged as the country which has the highest level of positive attitude towards Russia. And I'm Malaysian, so for me it was rather surprising seeing that we lost a plane, MH17. It was shot down by pro-Russian rebels. And you could say that everyone on the MH17, they were the first non-Ukrainian victims of Russian aggression. So, Richard, if I may beg your kind indulgence, could you comment on that? And then I'll go to the other 2 questions which I sent up earlier. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll speak to what we've seen in terms of just global public opinion about Russia, which is generally quite low. I mean, we ask a basic favorability measure, do you have a favorable, unfavorable opinion of Russia? And in most of the countries we survey around the world, it tends to be pretty negative, especially in Europe, United States, but in many other regions of the world as well. There are some exceptions, and South Asia, Southeast Asia, you do get higher ratings, but the global public sort of image of Russia has been pretty low, and it's been lower since the invasion of Ukraine. And similarly, not much confidence in President Putin when we ask about world leaders either. So the overall, global public opinion towards Russia is quite negative and has gone down in recent years following the invasion of Ukraine. To your other questions, I think we're sort of focused on social media and its role in some of these issues that we're talking about and its impact on society. So, to talk about social media a little bit, as we all know, it's spread around the world at a really rapid pace. As we all know, people are increasingly getting their news and information from social media, and it's shaping how they think about politics and lots of other issues too. And something our surveys have shown is that people have a lot of concerns about social media and its impact on society. So to give you an example of that, we conducted a survey in 25 countries around the world earlier this year. And we did something we've done many times in our surveys where we asked people about a number of different potential threats to their country. And for each one, we asked them, how big of a threat is this? And when we did that battery of questions this year, false information online rose to the top of the list for the first time. So, even compared with things like climate change, global economic problems, which of course people are very concerned about, they were even more concerned about the spread of false information online. So, it really shows how much people see this as a threat to their country. And we see it many other ways as well. We've seen specifically in our surveys that people say they're concerned about the ability of political leaders in their country to use misinformation essentially as a political weapon within their country. People are concerned about social media leading to less civility online when people talk about politics. They're worried that it essentially makes people more divided in political opinions in their country. So they have many, many different concerns. At the same time, I think it's always valuable to point out that people also see some positive aspects or potential aspects of the role social media can play in society. There's this kind of broad question we've asked in 27 different countries around the world at this point. Do you think that social media is having a good or bad impact on democracy in your country? And in most of the countries where we've asked that question, you actually get a majority saying they think it's been a positive sort of contributor to democracy in their country rather than a negative one. Not everywhere, not in the United States, which tends to be very negative about social media's impact. But in most countries, actually, people say it's had a positive impact. Now, how can that be given the sort of nastiness we know is out there in the online world, and the things that people tell us that they're concerned about when it comes to social media in our surveys. I think what we see is that people believe that there's at least the potential for social media to give them a voice at a time when they feel kind of voiceless, and to make sure the politicians represent them at a time when they don't feel represented. So you see, for instance, people saying that social media can make people more informed about international affairs, about domestic affairs. They say it can actually lead people to be more accepting of those who are different from them in terms of race and ethnicity and religion. And they say that it can actually make politicians pay attention to important issues, again, at a time when people don't feel like politicians are paying enough attention to the issues that people care about. They don't feel like people are listening to them. So I think when you look at our surveys and what are average citizens around the world telling us about social media, I think they're telling us that, on the one hand, certainly they see the negative aspects, or they see these negative impacts on society for sure. But they also see some potential upsides as well in terms of giving them voice, strengthening representation. And I think the challenge is how do we sort of lower the risk of all these negative elements of social media while enhancing these sort of components and aspects of social media that make people feel more empowered and more represented.
So just a quick follow-up. Do you have any suggestion on how people can be more savvy and more digitally wise when consuming content from the social media?
Yeah, well, certainly, as a researcher, I hope what we can do is to try to establish relationships of trust with people in our audiences, consumers and citizens out there, right? By providing facts and information that can inform important public debates about big, global issues. So, I think the hope is at least that, people can develop relationships with organizations and influencers or others that they can trust. But, at the moment, it's certainly difficult for people. They feel a bit lost. They don't know where to turn. They don't know who to trust. So I think that, for those of us in civil society, I think it's important to try to make contributions in terms of, sharing actual factual information, building audiences and establishing those relationships of trust, with consumers and citizens out there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, next up we have from Philippines, Ariza Nokum. She's the co-founder and president of Chris for Peace, a non-profit promoting peace through education in the Philippines. Since 2008, Chris has trained over 1,100 young leaders and provided grants to nearly 40 youth organizations. So my question to you is, during former President Duterte's rule from 2016 to from 2011 to 2016, it is estimated that more than 12,000 people were killed in his war against drugs that involved vigilante killings and police squads targeting mostly poor young men, according to Human Rights Watch. Thousands of women and children were left without husbands and fathers and had to fend for themselves. The killings, as we all know, were also very, very dehumanizing. With Duterte currently facing charges of crimes against humanity at The Hague, is such a dehumanizing and violent episode finally over in the Philippines? Or does civil society need to constantly work to prevent new autocrats from emerging?
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you again to the Global Town Hall for having me. So, for me, the short answer is sadly no. If the contemporary history of conflict and tensions in the Philippines were like a Netflix series, to me, the war on drugs is sadly just one episode. The big picture includes long-standing struggles such as the Moro or Muslim population struggle for autonomy, communist struggle, phases of violent extremism and terrorism by various groups, which we share with other countries in Southeast Asia, and even politically motivated killings and violence against the media. And looking at all of these struggles together, we do see that they have evolved in some ways for the better. So, for instance, you did mention the end of the war on drugs, which we do consider some sort of victory. Now, with the Moro or Muslim population having set up an autonomous government, we see that as a significant step forward as well. But the truth is that there is still a lot of work to be done. And honestly, looking at all these instances of conflict and struggle, there are several themes that jump out. And to me, this is important, bringing it here in this global town hall, because these themes are not just relevant to the Philippines, but also to the rest of the world. So the first, obviously, is having a massive power imbalance. We saw that with the administration of former President Duterte. We see that in these other struggles. We call ourselves a democracy, but to be honest, power continues to be concentrated with many elite groups, both in politics and business. And these power imbalances can be traced way back to the period of colonization. It seems to be like a ghost of slavery or colonialism that continues to haunt us today. The second theme that we see is the lack of representation of key groups such as women, young people, minority religions, and indigenous groups. One interesting thing I've heard from Mary Robinson is that she sees that the vacuum in moral and good leadership today is not gender neutral. She means to say that we need more women, we need more diverse people in power if we want to address this vacuum of moral leadership. And in the same way that, for instance, earlier, Dr. Leong talked about multiculturalism and how Singapore really invests its time and resources in making sure that there is this celebrated diversity in society. We don't see that in a lot of places. We don't see that yet, a lot of it in the Philippines. And obviously, we want to take a page more from Singapore. Another theme that comes out is more personal, We all have our prejudices and biases. And when you're talking about dehumanization, looking at people as less than human, these biases obviously play a big role. And lately, these biases have been sort of turbocharged because of social media. So obviously, we're talking about polarization. And during the war on drugs, this polarization played a really big role. A lot of content on social media seemed to have the intention of depicting drug addicts as not deserving of healing, not deserving of mercy, not deserving of dignity. And again, in these themes, we see obviously that it's not just little reforms that we need. We need sweeping transformations in education, media literacy, political participation, and even religion plays a big role in helping us to develop values that spur empathy and not hatred.
That's really inspiring, and you have identified and articulated a lot of issues that that it's kind of hard to see from outside. And just a quick follow up: your foundation has your foundation worked with victims of the drug wars? And if yes, how are those children faring? And what kind of care do such people what kind of care do those children and young people need based on your experience in working with marginalized youths?
Thank you, Amy. So we don't work directly with the victims of the drug wars, but we have a lot of experience working with communities impacted by conflict, violence, and marginalization. Our nonprofit, Chris for Peace, has worked with more than 1,000 young people from these backgrounds, and most of them are in southern Philippines, many communities that have sadly been impacted by not just years, but decades of conflict, violence, and terrorism. So, working with these young people, particularly to educate and empower them as leaders and peace builders, we've learned a few things over our more than 15 years of work. First, there is a lot of unresolved trauma. As a young person myself, I'm very happy to see that we're finally all talking about mental health. My parents agree that, mental health is something that we need to care about. Senior leaders also agree that mental health is something to care for. But sadly, there are still a lot of young people who are left at the sidelines in terms of unresolved trauma and mental health. Many of the youth we've worked with have gone through war, have lost loved ones, have been orphaned even, or continue to experience violence, and yet they don't have enough access to mental health support, things like therapy, things like medication if needed. And this needs to be a responsive approach because obviously at the heart of our mental health is our ability to function, our ability to think, our ability to feel. And without those things working in good order, how can we function as human beings? How can we maximize our potential? So that's one call to action I'm bringing out there. The other thing is that our approach also has to be proactive. Over a quarter of the world's population is composed of young people between 10 to 24 years old and higher, and yet they're often underrepresented in leadership and decision making. And sometimes their insights and decisions are even actively discounted or cast aside. And this is where we do our work. We support young people to gain access to education, learn skills to be leaders and peace builders, gain access to funding and a network, and be able to grab a seat at the table and make space for discussions that are truly intergenerational. So our objective, our big, hairy goal is to hopefully empower a new wave of moral leadership that ends wars and not starts them, hopefully prioritizes purpose over profit, and hopefully as well molds equality or prioritizes equality over ego.
Arisa, thank you so much. It was so insightful and so inspiring, and Philippines is very lucky to have you. Thank you. The next speaker is from India, Dr. Sundip Waslekar. He is the president of the Strategic Foresight Group, an international think tank which he founded in 2002. He is the author of the book A World Without War, and he has mediated in conflicts in South Asia and the Middle East. But my question is, what kind of global future do you foresee amid a background of great power competition between the US and China?
Thank you, Amy, and it's a great honor to be on the Global Town Hall. The competition between US and China is in some ways reminiscent of the days prior to the First World War, when there was a competition between Britain and Germany for naval supremacy. And currently, the competition between US and China is for technological and economic supremacy, which is leading to an AI arms race. And this AI arms race can go out of hand, and they might develop AI models which are out of human control, which could make it extremely difficult for human society to thrive and to be in control of its own species. But at the second level, what we have to see is that at any given time, there is a competition between big powers. Currently, it's US and China. Earlier, it was US and Soviet Union. Last century, it was Britain and Germany. So what we have to think is how do we shape a global future in a positive way when competition between big powers is inevitable? And the answer to that is that it is necessary to form an alliance of neutral countries that can mediate between the big powers. UN Security Council is not in a position to do it because the permanent membership of the Security Council is made of the five big powers. So what we need is a neutrality council or a Congress of neutral states. And there are at the moment 27 states which are either demilitarized or constitutionally neutral. And there are many other countries like Slovakia and Oman, which are not constitutionally neutral but are behaving in a fairly neutral fashion. So these 30 to 40 countries need to come together and form a bloc to prevent the competition between big powers from going out of hands.
Moving ahead, what kind of future do you foresee right now? Because early on you mentioned to me, that there are concepts and philosophies in which we can learn from the past.
Yes, currently we are in an era where nationalism seems to be a dominant philosophy in many countries. But there are philosophies, particularly from the global Orient, which profess exactly the theme of this session, that the word is one nation. Chikyu Minzu Kushugi, a Japanese philosophy, says that the word is one nation. Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the Indian philosophy, says the word is one family. Ubuntu, the South African philosophy, says I am because we are. And we need to see how to harness these philosophies and how to give them an institutional expression. And in order to do that, we need a global discourse on creating a global social contract. The social contract that Rousseau introduced in 1762 was in a national context. But now, many problems cross the national boundaries: COVID, arms race, carbon dioxide, climate change. They don't recognize national boundaries. So when we are facing many global problems, we need a new approach, a new philosophy, and a new way of thinking to create the world as one nation or one family.
Thank you so much, Doctor. We still have some time. I'd like to move on to the next speaker because we ran over some time with some session with some speaker. So the next speaker is Miroslav Lachowski. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He's a Slovak diplomat who served as the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of the Slovak Republic in 2023. The Slovakian Prime Minister Fico has said that the country will not join EU in providing military aid for Ukraine. Why is that so?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to Global Town Hall. I think it's a great idea, and you are doing an excellent job in connecting the world and helping us each other to understand the world better and to find some solutions, perhaps. When it comes to your question, Slovakia is a country which is next door neighbor to Ukraine. Actually, Ukraine is our largest neighbor when it comes to territory, and the war is ongoing for 4 years. So naturally, people are tired of this war, and I would say that the most tired probably are Ukrainians themselves. So I think Prime Minister Fico used the Ukraine topic on his election campaign, and during that election campaign 2 years ago, he said that we will send not a bullet to Ukraine. What we've seen in these 2 years, in fact, is that the amount of ammunition and weapons which transfer to Ukraine through Slovakia grow up tenfold. So basically, my prime minister unfortunately used some rhetoric and do something else, which might be good in this case, because I think we should support Ukraine as much as possible. And I agree very much with which was said by Natalie Toci. Why this conflict in Ukraine, this Russian aggression, has actually the global impact, and why it should matter to all of us, neighbors or people in Western Europe, as well as people in the world. The consequences are for all of us. I hope that we will manage to find some kind of closure of this war, as many people do. But I don't think that the way towards the ceasefire and peace, unfortunately, does not go through appeasement of aggressor. I simply don't think that this will work, and I think we have enough examples from the past that the appeasing of aggressor doesn't work and does not bring a sustainable peace.
How do you see the war in Ukraine proceeding? We have seen an American president who is much friendlier to President Putin. We have seen agreements being made, and yet sometimes no weapons being sent to Ukraine. So do you expect this war to go on for much longer?
Look, we all seen the meeting of President Trump with President Putin in Alaska. I think President Putin got a red carpet and didn't deliver for that red carpet anything. I think Russia is not ready for peace. I don't see any steps by Russians which leads to peace. So I look at it from the practical point of view. What were the steps after Alaska from the Russian side, which actually brought us closer to at least ceasefire, if not the peace negotiations? And I haven't seen much. So I think up until now, Russia is willing to continue this war. And that's very unfortunate. And the only answer is, there is this saying that if Russia stops the war will be over. If Ukraine will stop the fight, there will be no Ukraine. We said it 3 years ago, and I'm afraid it's still valid.
So in your view, will this go on for many more years to come? And what's likely to happen to Ukraine, because they are really suffering a lot right now? Will they be able to keep up the good fight that they are fighting right now?
I think what we see is that the something which was really meant by Kremlin as a special military operation, which should have take 2 weeks or 1 month, became a prolonged attrition war, and I think it is a competition who will be able to stay at that war longer. And unfortunately, Russia is much bigger and has an energy resources and military resources which are far bigger than Ukrainian. But there is a will on the Ukrainian side, and the question is how much we are able to help Ukrainians to stay the course and fight for their independence and territorial integrity until Russia will make finally the move that, okay, we want to make a deal. We want to make a peace. And this deal must be done in a way that it will be not over the heads either Ukrainians or Europeans. Everyone should be involved to make it a sustainable peace, sustainable solution.
Thank you so much. With this, we have come to the end of the Global Town Hall. I would like to thank each and every speaker for making your time and for sharing your most invaluable insights for us. Also, a big thank you to the organizers and everyone who tuned in to join us for this year's Global Town Hall. I, for one, it's been a great pleasure and I've learned a lot tonight. So thank you so much. Until next year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
It was a great pleasure.
Thank you, Amy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching the session on My Nationalism is Humanity. We Are One is Better Than We're Number One. Our final session of the day is Religions for Peace, Pushing Back Against the Rising Tide of Bigotry and Prejudice. It will begin shortly, so please stay tuned.